Keisha's scream echoed through the mansion as she pulled the writhing insects from 8-year-old Marco's ear, their tiny bodies having stolen his hearing for years. The truth she uncovered would destroy the very man she was falling in love with, because the person who put those creatures there was someone Luis trusted with his life. Tell us your city below, then enjoy the story and subscribe for more. Now let's get to the story. 8 months earlier, Luis Castellano had been a man carved from granite and shadow, his empire built on respect earned through strategic power moves that left no room for mercy. But Marco's silence had hollowed him out from the inside, turning every day into a reminder of failure. His failure to protect his son, his failure to save his wife, his failure to be anything more than a destroyer in a world that demanded creation. The morning Keisha Washington walked through the front doors of the Castellano estate, Luis was standing in his study, watching Marco play silently in the garden below. His son moved through the world like a ghost, beautiful and untouchable, communicating only through gestures that broke Luis's heart daily. "Mr. Castellano?" The voice behind him was confident, almost challenging. Luis turned to find a young woman whose presence immediately commanded attention. Keisha Washington was 22, with rich, dark skin that seemed to glow in the morning light, natural hair pulled back in a style that emphasized her striking cheekbones, and eyes that held intelligence and determination in equal measure. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a white blouse, but carried herself like royalty. "Miss Washington." Luis studied her carefully. "You understand this position requires complete discretion?" "I understand a lot of things, Mr. Castellano." Her tone held just enough respect to avoid disrespect, but enough independence to establish she wouldn't be intimidated. "I understand you need someone to care for your son. I understand your previous housekeepers didn't last long. And I understand you're probably wondering if a 22-year-old from the South Side knows anything about raising children." Despite everything, Luis found himself almost smiling. "And do you? I raised 3 younger siblings while my mama worked double shifts at the hospital." Keisha's voice softened slightly. "I know about scared kids, stubborn kids, and kids who communicate differently than everyone expects. What I don't know is why a man with your resources hasn't found better solutions for his son's condition." The directness of her question caught Luis off guard. Most people tiptoed around Marco's deafness, afraid to acknowledge what everyone could see. "Believe me, Miss Washington, I've explored every option available." "Have you?" She tilted her head, studying him with those sharp eyes. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you've given up." The words hit like a physical blow. Luis felt his jaw tighten, felt the familiar surge of anger that had served him well in business. But before he could respond, Marco appeared in the doorway, drawn perhaps by their conversation he couldn't hear. The change in Keisha's demeanor was immediate and complete. She dropped to Marco's eye level, her expression transforming from challenging to warm. "You must be Marco." She spoke while simultaneously signing, her movements fluid and natural. "I'm Keisha. I'm here to help take care of things around the house." Marco's eyes widened. It had been months since anyone had signed to him directly, treating his deafness as a communication difference rather than a limitation. "He's beautiful," Keisha said, looking up at Luis. "And smart. Look how quickly he picked up on my signing style." Luis watched his son's face light up in a way he hadn't seen since before his wife's death. In that moment, he made a decision based entirely on instinct, rather than the careful calculation that governed his professional life. "The position is yours, Miss Washington. Mrs. Chen will show you to your room and explain your duties." "Actually," Keisha stood gracefully, "I'd prefer Marco show me around, if that's okay with him." Marco nodded enthusiastically, taking her hand without hesitation. As Luis watched them leave together, his son animated and engaged for the first time in months, he couldn't shake the feeling that Keisha Washington was going to change everything. What he didn't know was how right he was, or how dangerous that change would prove to be. 3 weeks into her employment, Keisha had established a routine that brought life back to the estate's quieter corners. She woke early to prepare meals that coaxed Marco's appetite, maintained the household with efficiency that impressed even Mrs. Chen, and most importantly, treated Marco like any other 8-year-old boy who happened to communicate through sign language. But it was during these quiet morning hours, watching Marco at breakfast, that Keisha first noticed something that would change everything. "Marco, baby, hold still for a second." She knelt beside his chair, studying his left ear. "There's something—" Marco instinctively pulled away, as he always did when anyone approached his ears. But Keisha had spent enough time with him to recognize the difference between normal childhood resistance and genuine discomfort. "Does it hurt?" she asked, signing simultaneously. Marco's expression was confused. He touched his ear, then shook his head, but his body language suggested something else entirely. Over the following days, Keisha began documenting her observations. Marco's balance was occasionally off, more than typical for a child his age. He sometimes tilted his head at odd angles, as if trying to relieve pressure. Most telling, when she tested his peripheral vision, his responses were inconsistent, almost as if something was blocking not just sound, but spatial awareness. "Mrs. Chen," Keisha approached the older woman while Marco napped. "How long has Marco been completely deaf?" "Since birth." "Dear, poor little angel." His mother was heartbroken. "But has anyone ever actually looked inside his ears? I mean, really looked?" Mrs. Chen frowned. "Of course, the best doctors in Chicago. They said his auditory nerves were underdeveloped. Nothing to be done." Keisha nodded, but her mind was racing. That evening, she researched childhood deafness on her laptop, cross-referencing Marco's symptoms with various conditions. What she found didn't match his specific behaviors at all. The next morning, she was playing with Marco in the garden when he suddenly stopped, pressing his palm against his left ear, with an expression of clear discomfort. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" She knelt beside him, watching his face carefully. Marco made a motion she'd never seen before, pointing to his ear, then making a wiggling gesture with his fingers. Keisha's blood went cold. "Marco, does something move in your ear sometimes?" The boy nodded emphatically, relief flooding his features at finally being understood. "Show me exactly where." She guided his hand to point at his ear canal. Luis chose that moment to join them in the garden, coffee in hand, drawn by their animated conversation. "Everything all right?" His voice held the perpetual concern that colored every interaction involving his son. Keisha looked up at him, her mind calculating how to proceed. "Mr. Castellano, I need to ask you something, and I need you to trust my judgment." "What kind of question?" "When was the last time someone physically examined Marco's ear canals? Not just hearing tests, actual physical examination of the interior structure." Luis's expression hardened. "I told you we've seen every specialist available." "That's not what I asked." Keisha's voice was gentle but firm. "Marco just indicated something moves inside his ear. When I asked if it hurt, he couldn't explain, but his body language suggests pressure, not pain." "What are you suggesting?" Before she could answer, Marco tugged on her shirt, pointing urgently at his ear again. This time the wiggling motion was more pronounced, more desperate. "I'm suggesting," Keisha said carefully, "that we get a very bright light and actually look." Luis stared at her for a long moment, then at his son. The hope in Marco's eyes was devastating, the look of a child who finally believed someone might help him. "Mrs. Chen," Luis called toward the house, "bring the medical kit from my study." 10 minutes later, they had Marco seated comfortably on the garden bench, Mrs. Chen holding a powerful LED light, while Keisha gently positioned Marco's head for optimal visibility. "You're going to be a brave boy, aren't you?" Keisha signed to Marco. "Just hold very still for Mama Keisha." The endearment slipped out naturally, but Luis caught it, something warming in his chest despite his anxiety. Keisha leaned in, using a small magnifying glass from the medical kit. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then her sharp intake of breath made Luis step closer. "What is it?" Keisha's face had gone pale. "Luis, you need to see this, but prepare yourself." She moved aside, guiding Luis into position with the light and magnifying glass. What he saw would haunt him forever. Deep in Marco's ear canal, clearly visible with proper lighting, were dozens of tiny moving insects. They appeared to be some kind of beetle, their dark bodies writhing against each other in the confined space, creating a living blockage that would effectively prevent any sound from reaching the inner ear. "Dear God," Luis whispered. Marco, sensing the tension, began to shift restlessly. "Stay calm," Keisha instructed. "We can't scare him." "But Luis, someone put these here. This didn't happen naturally. Someone deliberately placed insects in your son's ear canal, probably when he was very young." The words hit Luis like bullets. In his world, such deliberate cruelty was a declaration of war. Who? The single word contained enough rage to level buildings. "That's what we need to find out. But first, we need to get them out safely. And Luis?" Keisha met his eyes, her expression serious. When we do, Marco is going to hear for the first time in his life, everything is about to change. The removal process required every ounce of Keisha's patience and Luis's self-control. Using tweezers sterilized in boiling water and a steady hand that surprised even herself, Keisha worked for over an hour while Luis held Marco steady, signing reassurance and distraction. "Almost done, baby," she whispered, extracting another beetle. "You're being so brave." Luis watched in fascination and horror as insect after insect emerged from his son's ear. 23 in total, enough to completely block sound transmission while still allowing the child to live normally otherwise. As the last beetle was removed, Marco suddenly jerked, his eyes wide with shock. "Daddy?" The word was small, uncertain, but perfectly clear. Luis froze. In 8 years, he had never heard his son's voice. "Marco!" Luis's own voice cracked. "Can you hear me?" "It's so loud," Marco whispered, covering his ears with his hands. "Everything is so loud." Keisha quickly moved to reduce the overwhelming sensory input. "It's okay, sweetheart. Your brain needs time to adjust. We'll take it slow." For the next hour, they helped Marco navigate his newly functioning hearing. Every sound was a revelation. Birds singing, leaves rustling, the distant hum of traffic. But it was Luis's voice that captivated him most. "Say my name again, Daddy." "Marco." Luis's eyes filled with tears he hadn't shed since his wife's funeral. "My son." But as the initial joy subsided, the darker implications settled in. Luis's expression hardened as he processed what this discovery meant. "Mrs. Chen," he called quietly, "please take Marco inside, help him adjust to household sounds gradually." Once they were alone, Luis turned to Keisha with eyes that had gone dangerously cold. "You understand what you've uncovered here. Someone tried to permanently disable your son." Keisha's voice was steady. "Someone with access to him as an infant. Someone who wanted him to appear defective. In my business, that would be someone who wanted to ensure Marco could never inherit what I've built." Luis's hands clenched into fists. "The only people with that level of access—" "Family," Keisha finished. Luis was already reaching for his phone. "I need to make some calls. Private conversations with people who were present during Marco's first few months of life." "Luis," Keisha caught his arm. "Be careful. Whoever did this has been living in your inner circle for 8 years, watching you suffer, watching Marco struggle. They're patient, clever, and completely without conscience, which describes half the men I work with." His smile was razor sharp. "But I know how to flush out rats, Keisha. I've been doing it longer than you've been alive." She studied his face, seeing both the loving father who had just heard his son's voice and the dangerous man who controlled half of Chicago's underground economy. "What do you need from me?" "Watch Marco, keep him safe, and whatever you do, don't let anyone know what we discovered today. If the person responsible realizes we know the truth, they'll escalate to more direct methods." "More direct how?" Luis's expression answered before his words did. "People who would torture a baby to prevent inheritance don't hesitate to arrange permanent solutions." Keisha felt ice form in her stomach. "You're talking about killing a child. I'm talking about someone who already tried to destroy my son's life once. They won't get a second chance." That evening, as Keisha helped Marco process his new world of sound, she watched Luis make a series of phone calls from his study. Through the windows, she could see his face change with each conversation, calculating, analyzing, eliminating possibilities. She was falling in love with a man who lived by rules she barely understood, in a world where family loyalty and ruthless betrayal coexisted like opposing elements in the same chemical compound. But as she watched Marco laugh with delight at the sound of his own voice, Keisha knew she would protect this child with her life, even if it meant standing beside a man capable of violence she couldn't imagine. What she didn't know was that across town, someone was already planning to ensure neither she nor Marco lived to see the consequences of their discovery. Luis's investigation began before dawn. Years of surviving in a world where information equaled power had taught him to approach family betrayal with the same methodical precision he used for business rivalries. He started with medical records, using contacts in the city's hospital system to trace everyone who had access to Marco during his first months of life. The list was disturbingly short. Luis himself, his deceased wife Sophia, Mrs. Chen, the family pediatrician, and his cousin Roberto. Roberto Castellano, Luis's closest blood relative and most trusted lieutenant, the man who had stood beside Luis's bed when Marco was born, who had comforted Sophia during difficult postpartum recovery. who had mourned with them when doctors declared Marco permanently deaf. Luis stared at Roberto's name on the paper, memory after memory clicking into place with sickening clarity. Roberto suggesting they accept God's will regarding Marco's condition. Roberto discouraging additional medical consultations. Roberto always present during family discussions about Marco's future, expressing concern that the boy would never be strong enough to handle family responsibilities. The phone on Luis's desk rang. Don Castellano? The voice belonged to Dr. Patricia Reyes, the pediatrician who had originally diagnosed Marco's condition. You asked me to review my notes from 2015. What did you find? Something troubling. According to my records, I recommended a complete otolaryngological workup, including physical examination of ear canal structure. But my follow-up notes indicate you declined the procedure. Luis gripped the phone tighter. I never declined anything. I wanted every test possible. The decision came through your medical proxy, your cousin Roberto. He said the family preferred to avoid traumatizing the baby with invasive procedures when the outcome was already clear. The betrayal hit Luis like a physical blow. Roberto had deliberately blocked medical care that would have discovered the insects 8 years ago. Dr. Reyes, I need you to document everything we just discussed, every conversation, every decision that was made on my behalf. Mr. Castellano, if there was medical neglect involved, there was deliberate sabotage involved. And I need evidence. After ending the call, Luis sat in his study staring at family photos that lined the walls. In every picture from Marco's early years, Roberto was present, holding the baby, standing beside Sophia, positioned as the devoted family protector. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Keisha entered quietly, carrying coffee and concern in equal measure. Marco's napping, all the new sounds exhausted him. She set down the cup, studying Luis's expression. You look like someone died. Someone might. Luis's voice was deadly calm. I know who did it. Keisha sat across from him, waiting. Roberto, my cousin, the man I trusted with my son's medical care when I was traveling on business. Luis's laugh was bitter. The man I named as Marco's guardian in case anything happened to me. Your own cousin tried to permanently disable your child? In our family structure, if Marco couldn't inherit, leadership would pass to Roberto's branch, but as long as Marco existed as a potential heir, Roberto's position was temporary. Luis stood, pacing to the window. By making Marco appear mentally defective, Roberto eliminated him from succession without actually killing him. Clever, Keisha said quietly, and completely evil. The question now is what to do about it. Keisha was quiet for several minutes, thinking, in your world, what's the usual response to this kind of betrayal? Luis met her eyes. Roberto disappears, permanently. And what message does that send to Marco? That when someone hurts you, the solution is violence. The message it sends is that no one harms my family without consequences. Luis. Keisha stood, moving to face him directly. What if there was another way? A way that gets justice without making you the kind of man Marco should be afraid of? What kind of way? Roberto betrayed you, stole 8 years of your son's life, and blocked medical care that could have prevented years of suffering. Those are serious crimes, real legal consequences. Luis stared at her. You want me to call the police? I want you to destroy him the same way he tried to destroy Marco. Systematically, methodically and completely. Expose what he did. Make sure everyone in your organization knows he's a traitor who hurts children. Let your own people handle him according to their code. The brilliance of her suggestion hit him immediately. In their world, men who harmed children were marked for death by their own peers. Roberto would face justice from people who understood exactly how unforgivable his actions were. You're suggesting I let the family decide his fate. I'm suggesting you let the truth decide his fate. Keisha moved closer. But Luis, once you expose this, there's no going back. Roberto won't just accept defeat quietly. What do you mean? I mean if he's desperate enough to torture a baby, he's desperate enough to eliminate anyone who threatens his position, including us. Luis felt something cold settle in his chest. Are you saying you want to leave, take Marco and run? I'm saying I'm not going anywhere. Keisha's voice was firm. Marco needs stability and you need someone who isn't afraid of the truth. But we need to be smart about this. Smart how? Roberto doesn't know we've discovered what he did. We use that advantage. Set a trap. She smiled, and for the first time, Luis saw steel behind her warm exterior. Let him think he's won, until it's too late for him to do anything but face the consequences. Luis studied this remarkable woman who had walked into his life and changed everything. His son's future, his perspective on justice, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name yet. You realize what you're proposing could get us both killed. Luis Castellano. Keisha stepped closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, see the determination in her dark eyes. I've been taking care of myself since I was 14. I'm not about to let some coward who hurts babies intimidate me now. In that moment, Luis felt something shift between them, partnership becoming something deeper, more dangerous, more precious than either had expected. The plan Keisha and Luis developed was elegant in its simplicity. They would host a family gathering to celebrate Marco's miraculous improvement, implying his hearing had naturally developed rather than been restored. Roberto would be forced to attend, and his reactions would either confirm or eliminate him as a suspect. More importantly, they would quietly document everything, building an irrefutable case before making any accusations. Remember, Keisha coached Marco as they prepared for the gathering, we're pretending your hearing got better slowly. Over the past few weeks, can you do that for Daddy and me? Marco nodded seriously. At 8 years old, he understood that some games were more important than others. The family began arriving that evening. Luis watched each face carefully as they interacted with Marco, looking for tells for reactions that seemed forced or calculated. Roberto arrived precisely on time, carrying gifts and wearing the concerned expression of a devoted uncle. Marco, he knelt to the boy's level. Mrs. Chen tells me you've been hearing better. That's wonderful news. It started slow, Marco said carefully, repeating the script they'd practiced. First just loud sounds, then more and more. Amazing. Roberto's smile seemed genuine. Medical miracles do happen. But Keisha noticed something else. Roberto's eyes, scanning the room, lingering on her face with speculation that made her skin crawl. As the evening progressed, Luis introduced Keisha to various family members as Marco's new caregiver. The responses were politely positive except for Roberto's. She's very young, Roberto murmured to Luis during a quiet moment. Are you certain she's qualified for such responsibility? Marco seems comfortable with her. Of course, but children adapt to anyone who shows them attention. The question is whether she truly understands the complexities of our family situation. Luis felt warning bells in his head. What complexities? Security concerns, the need for absolute discretion regarding family matters, the importance of loyalty above all else. Roberto's gaze drifted toward Keisha. Sometimes outsiders bring complications we don't anticipate. Keisha has been nothing but helpful, I'm sure, but Luis, consider, Marco's improvement coincides exactly with her arrival. Don't you find that timing suspicious? The manipulation was so smooth, so perfectly calculated, that Luis almost missed it. Roberto was planting seeds of doubt about Keisha, while simultaneously taking credit for recognizing Marco's improvement. Later that evening, after the family had left, Luis shared Roberto's comments with Keisha. He's positioning himself, she said immediately, making it seem like Marco's recovery is suspicious, like maybe I did something to cause his previous condition. He's preparing to make me the villain if his secret gets exposed, which means he knows we're getting close to the truth. Or worse, he knows exactly what the truth is because he's responsible for it. They were interrupted by a soft knock. Marco appeared in his pajamas, tears streaming down his face. What's wrong, baby? Keisha knelt beside him. I heard Uncle Roberto on the phone, Marco whispered. He was talking about making sure you go away. Luis felt ice in his veins. What exactly did you hear? He said the new woman was asking too many questions. He said problems like that need to be handled permanently. Keisha and Luis exchanged glances. The investigation phase was over. Marco, Luis said gently, I need you to pack some clothes. We're going to stay somewhere safe for a few days. Are we in danger? We're being careful, Keisha answered. Sometimes grown-ups need to have difficult conversations, and children should be somewhere peaceful while that happens. As they prepared to leave the estate, Luis made 3 phone calls. The first was to his most trusted security team. The second was to his lawyer, documenting everything they'd discovered. The third was to his consigliere, requesting an emergency family meeting. Luis, Keisha touched his arm as they loaded suitcases into his car. Once you call this meeting, everything changes. Roberto will know you're on to him. Good. I'm tired of playing defense. Just remember, He's had 8 years to plan for this possibility. He won't go down without a fight. Neither will I. As they drove toward the safe house Luis maintained across town, none of them noticed the black sedan that began following at a discreet distance. Roberto's preparations were already in motion, and he had no intention of allowing Luis or Keisha to reach their destination alive. The war for Marco's future was about to begin, and only one side would survive to see the boy grow up. The black sedan maintained its distance for 12 blocks before Luis spotted it in his rearview mirror. Years of survival in Chicago's underground had taught him to recognize professional surveillance, and this tale was too smooth, too patient to be coincidental. "We have company," he said quietly, not wanting to alarm Marco, who was dozing in the back seat. Keisha glanced back, spotting the vehicle immediately. "How long?" "Since we left the house." "Roberto works fast." Luis's jaw tightened. "Hold on." The next few minutes tested every defensive driving skill Luis had acquired during 2 decades of staying alive in a dangerous business. He took sharp turns, doubled back through residential neighborhoods, and used one-way streets to create separation. But the sedan matched every move with professional precision. "They're not trying to catch us," Keisha observed. "They're herding us." She was right. Each time Luis tried to head toward downtown or populated areas, the sedan would accelerate slightly, forcing him to choose different routes. They were being guided toward the warehouse district, isolated, industrial, perfect for activities that required privacy. "Luis, we can't lead them to the safe house." "I know." He pulled into an all-night diner's parking lot, mind racing through options. Change of plan. Inside the diner, Luis made 3 rapid phone calls while Keisha kept Marco distracted with hot chocolate and comic books. The conversations were brief, coded, urgent. "Vincent will meet us at the alternate location," Luis told her quietly. "My security team is already moving to intercept our tail." "What alternate location?" "Somewhere Roberto doesn't know about. Somewhere I keep for situations exactly like this." They waited 30 minutes, watching through the diner's windows as 2 large SUVs arrived and surrounded the black sedan. The confrontation was brief and efficient, no violence visible, but the sedan's occupants were clearly outmaneuvered. Luis's phone buzzed with a text. "Package secured. Route clear." "Time to go," he said. The alternate safe house turned out to be a modest apartment building in Little Italy, unremarkable and deliberately ordinary. Luis explained as they climbed to the 3rd floor that he maintained 3 separate safe locations, each known only to different members of his inner circle. "Roberto knows about the main house and the lake property, but this place? Only Vincent and I have access." The apartment itself was comfortable but sparse, clearly designed for temporary occupation rather than long-term living. Marco explored excitedly, fascinated by the new sounds he could hear through thin walls: neighbors' televisions, street traffic, a dog barking somewhere nearby. "It's so much louder here than at home," he marveled. "City living," Keisha smiled. "Lots more people, lots more noise." But Luis was focused on more serious concerns. He called his consigliere, Marco Rossini, and scheduled an emergency family meeting for the following evening. "What will you tell them?" Keisha asked after he hung up. "The truth, all of it. Roberto's betrayal, the evidence we've gathered, what he tried to do to Marco." Luis's expression was grim. "In our world, some violations are unforgivable. Harming children tops that list. And then? Then the family decides Roberto's fate according to our code." Keisha was quiet for several minutes, watching Marco play with toys Luis had thought to pack. "Luis, can I ask you something personal? After everything we've been through together, I think personal is relative. When this is over, when Roberto is dealt with and Marco is safe, what happens to us?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither had fully acknowledged until now. "What do you want to happen?" Luis asked carefully. "I want to wake up every morning knowing Marco is safe and loved. I want to hear him laugh and watch him discover new things and help him navigate a world that finally makes sense to him." She paused. "And I want to be with the man who loves him enough to risk everything for his well-being, even though that man comes with complications most people wouldn't accept. Luis, I knew what your world involved before I took this job. What I didn't know was that I'd fall in love with a man who reads bedtime stories in 3 languages, who hasn't missed a single one of Marco's therapy sessions, and who would tear apart his entire organization to protect one little boy." Luis crossed the room, taking her hands in his. "Keisha Washington, Are you telling me you're in love with a crime boss? I'm telling you I'm in love with Marco's father. The fact that you happen to run half of Chicago is just an occupational hazard I'm willing to accept. Their first real kiss happened while Marco was absorbed in building block constructions, the sound of children's laughter from the apartment below providing an oddly perfect soundtrack. It was a kiss that tasted like promises and felt like coming home after a long journey through dangerous territory. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. After tomorrow night, Luis said quietly, everything will be different, better or worse, but different. Then we better make sure it's better. Outside, night was falling over Chicago, and across town, Roberto Castellano was making his own preparations for the family meeting. He had no intention of allowing Luis to present any evidence, and his plan would ensure that both Luis and the troublesome young woman, who had discovered too much, would be permanently silenced before they could speak a word. But Roberto had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated exactly how far a man would go to protect his family, and how dangerous Keisha Washington could be when someone threatened the people she loved. The family meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock at Rossini's restaurant, a neutral location where the Castellano family had conducted business for 3 generations. Luis arrived early with Vincent and 2 other trusted soldiers, while Keisha and Marco remained at the safe house under heavy protection. Roberto entered precisely on time, accompanied by 3 men Luis didn't immediately recognize, a concerning development that suggested Roberto had been building his own power base within the family structure. "Cousin," Roberto's greeting was perfectly cordial. "Thank you for calling this meeting. We have much to discuss." Marco Rossini, the family's consigliere, called the gathering to order with the formal protocols that had governed their organization for decades. "Luis has requested this meeting to address serious allegations of family betrayal. Roberto, you have the right to hear these accusations and respond accordingly." Luis stood, his voice carrying clearly through the private dining room. "For 8 years, we believed Marco's deafness was a tragic accident of birth. 3 days ago, we discovered the truth. He produced a small glass vial containing the insects Keisha had extracted from Marco's ear. 23 beetles, deliberately placed in my son's ear canal when he was an infant. Someone with access to Marco during his first months of life committed an act of deliberate sabotage designed to make him appear mentally defective." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Several family members leaned forward to examine the vial, their expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. "Furthermore," Luis continued, "medical records show that comprehensive ear examinations were recommended by Marco's pediatrician and deliberately blocked by someone acting as my medical proxy." Roberto stood slowly, his expression carefully controlled. "Luis, these are serious accusations, but before we proceed, I think this gathering needs to address a more pressing concern." "What concern?" "The young woman you've allowed into our family circle, Keisha Washington." Roberto's voice took on a tone of regretful concern. "We've discovered some troubling information about Miss Washington's background." Luis felt ice forming in his stomach. Roberto's counterattack was beginning. "What kind of information?" Roberto nodded to one of his companions, who produced a manila folder. "Financial records showing regular payments from federal law enforcement agencies, communication logs indicating contact with FBI field agents, and most concerning, evidence that she specifically sought employment with your family under false pretenses." The implications hit the room like a physical blow. In their world, federal informants were a death sentence waiting to happen. "You're suggesting Keisha is working with the FBI?" Luis's voice was dangerously calm. "I'm suggesting she appeared in your life at precisely the moment she could do maximum damage. Your son's miraculous recovery coincides exactly with her arrival. The insects you claim to have found? How convenient that she was the one to discover them." Roberto's manipulation was masterful. He was twisting the timeline, making Keisha's genuine discovery seem like planted evidence, designed to frame someone else. "Think about it, Luis. She gains your trust by curing your son, then feeds you a story about family betrayal that turns you against your most loyal blood relative. Classic federal manipulation tactics." Several family members were nodding, the logic compelling despite being completely false. Roberto continued his assault. "The question we need to ask is this: did the beetles even exist, or did Miss Washington plant them to create a false medical emergency that would position her as Marco's savior?" Luis's phone buzzed with an emergency text from Vincent. "Safe house compromised. K&M moving to location 3. Feds surrounding building. Roberto smiled. I believe you just received confirmation that Miss Washington's real employers have made their move. But Luis was already calculating, seeing the pattern Roberto had missed. You're right about one thing. Roberto, this is definitely a setup. Exactly, we need to… The setup is yours. Luis's voice cut through the room like a blade. You knew about this meeting 24 hours in advance. You knew where Keisha and Marco were staying. You're the only person outside my immediate security team who could have fed that information to federal agents. Luis, you're not thinking clearly. The woman has poisoned your judgment. The woman saved my son's life, and you just proved you've been working with the feds yourself because you knew they were moving against the safe house before I did. The realization hit the room like an explosion. Roberto's face went pale as he recognized his fatal mistake. Luis pulled out his phone, dialing Keisha's number on speaker so the entire gathering could hear. Luis? Her voice was tight with tension. We're okay, but there are federal agents everywhere. They're demanding to search the apartment for evidence of money laundering operations. Keisha, I need you to tell everyone here exactly what you discovered about Marco's condition. The beetles? Luis, there were 23 insects blocking his ear canal. Someone placed them there when he was very young, specifically positioned to prevent sound transmission without causing obvious medical distress. Roberto made a desperate play. Anyone can claim anything over the phone. This proves nothing. But Vincent had entered the restaurant, escorting Dr. Patricia Reyes, Marco's original pediatrician. Dr. Reyes, Luis addressed her formally, please tell this gathering what you told me yesterday about my son's original diagnosis. I recommended comprehensive ear canal examination when Marco was 6 months old. The procedure was blocked by Roberto Castellano, acting as medical proxy, who stated the family preferred to avoid traumatizing the child with invasive testing. Roberto was trapped, his web of lies collapsing around him, but cornered rats were always the most dangerous. This is all fabricated, he snarled. Luis has been planning this betrayal for months, using that federal informant to… He never finished the sentence. Vincent's gun appeared in his hand with practiced smoothness. Nobody calls the Don's woman a Fed, Vincent said calmly. Especially not child-torturing trash like you. The family meeting had become something else entirely, a reckoning 8 years in the making. The confrontation in Rossini's restaurant lasted only minutes, but those minutes changed everything. When Roberto finally confessed, partly from cornered desperation, partly from Vincent's very persuasive interrogation techniques, the truth that emerged was even worse than Luis had imagined. It was supposed to be temporary, Roberto gasped, blood running from his nose where Vincent had been particularly insistent about honesty. Just until Sophia died, until grief made you careless enough to make mistakes. Then I would have discovered a cure, positioned myself as the hero who saved your heir. But Sophia didn't die on your timeline, Luis said, understanding flooding through him. She lived for 3 years after Marco was born. 3 years of watching you actually be happy, of watching her love you despite your weaknesses, of knowing that as long as she lived, you'd never need me the way you should have. The room went dead silent. Even the hardened criminals present were shocked by the implication. You killed my wife. Luis's voice was barely a whisper. I accelerated her cancer timeline, made sure the experimental treatments she was receiving were replaced with placebos. She was going to die anyway. I just ensured it happened when it was most beneficial for family stability. Vincent's gun moved closer to Roberto's head. Don Castellano, give me the word. But before Luis could respond, his phone rang. Keisha's name appeared on the screen. Luis, we have a problem. The FBI agents aren't here for money laundering. They're here because someone told them you were involved in Sophia's death. They have medical records, testimony from pharmaceutical suppliers, everything. Luis closed his eyes, seeing Roberto's final play clearly. Even facing exposure and death, his cousin was still maneuvering. How long do we have? Minutes, maybe less. Luis, they have arrest warrants. For you and for me as an accessory after the fact. Roberto smiled through his pain. I told you I had backup plans, cousin. If I go down, we all go down. Marco Rossini stepped forward. As consigliere, family law was his domain. Roberto, you've confessed to harming a child and murdering a family member. Both carry automatic death sentences under our code. Execute me then. But Luis will still spend life in federal prison, and the little prince will grow up knowing his father is a convicted killer. The trap was perfect. Roberto had ensured that even his death wouldn't save Luis or Marco from the consequences of the truth being exposed. Luis looked around the room at faces that had been part of his life for decades, men who had sworn loyalty, who had built their world on honor and family protection. In their eyes he saw the calculation happening: support him against federal prosecution or cut ties to save themselves. His phone rang again. This time, it was Vincent's security team. "Don Castellano, we have a situation. Miss Washington and your son are safe, but the building is surrounded. They're demanding unconditional surrender within 10 minutes, or they start arresting everyone in the vicinity." Unconditional surrender for what? Murder conspiracy, child endangerment, money laundering, and RICO violations. Sir, they have enough evidence to destroy the entire organization. Luis understood. Roberto had been feeding information to federal authorities for months, building a case that would eliminate both Luis and Marco, while positioning himself as a cooperative witness deserving of protection. "Luis," Keisha's voice came back on the line, "whatever you're thinking, don't. Marco needs his father alive more than he needs you to be a hero." "She's right, Doctor," Reyes said quietly. "That boy has been through enough trauma. Don't let adult vengeance steal his chance at a normal life." Luis looked at Roberto, seeing not just the man who had tortured his son and killed his wife, but the cousin who had once been his closest friend, who had stood beside him during their grandfather's funeral, who had promised to protect family above all else. "You want to know what real strength looks like, Roberto?" Luis's voice was steady. "It looks like choosing your son's future over your own revenge." He turned to Marco Rossini. "I'm turning myself into federal authorities. Whatever deal needs to be made to protect Marco and Keisha." "Make it!" "Luis, no!" Roberto struggled to his feet. "You can't just surrender. Fight this! Like you fought for family honor when you tortured my infant son." Luis's contempt was absolute. "You destroyed yourself the moment you chose betrayal over blood." He walked toward the door, pausing only to address the gathering one final time. "Marco Rossini, you're now acting head of this family. Roberto Castellano is hereby expelled from family protection. What happens to him next is between him and his conscience." As Luis left the restaurant, heading toward federal custody and an uncertain future, he carried one absolute certainty: Marco would grow up safe, loved and free from the corrupted legacy that had poisoned 3 generations of Castellano men. Behind him, in the gathering silence, Roberto finally understood that real power wasn't about control or manipulation. It was about sacrificing everything for the people you loved most. The federal holding facility was nothing like the movies suggested. Luis sat in a sterile interview room, facing Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez, who had laid out enough evidence to convict him 10 times over. The documents spread across the metal table, told a story of financial crimes, violent intimidation and conspiracy charges that could result in life imprisonment. "Mr. Castellano, your cousin has been very cooperative. Phone records, financial transactions, witness testimony about your organization's activities." Martinez's voice was professional but not unkind. "He's given us everything we need to dismantle your entire operation." Luis remained silent, his lawyer whispering legal strategies that all sounded like variations of plea bargaining and reduced sentences. "However," Martinez continued, "there are some unusual aspects to this case that warrant consideration." She produced a different folder, this one containing medical records and crime scene photos. "Roberto Castellano's confession regarding your son's condition and your wife's death. These allegations suggest you were as much a victim of his manipulation as anyone else." Luis looked up sharply. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that poisoning a child and murdering a family member are federal crimes that carry significant weight in prosecutorial decision-making. If Roberto committed these acts while also feeding information to build cases against you, it raises questions about the reliability of his testimony." Luis's lawyer leaned forward. "Are you suggesting the charges might be reduced?" "I'm suggesting that cases built on testimony from someone who confesses to torturing children and murdering family members tend to have credibility issues with juries." Martinez opened another file. "There's also the matter of Miss Washington's testimony. She's provided a detailed account of discovering your son's condition, of Roberto's attempts to frame her as a federal informant, and of his threats against both her life and the child's welfare." Keisha testified. "Voluntarily. She walked into our field office this morning and demanded to tell her side of the story. Her account contradicts Roberto's version of events in several crucial ways. Martinez slid a transcript across the table. As Luis read Keisha's testimony, he saw how thoroughly she had demolished Roberto's lies while providing context that painted Luis not as a criminal mastermind, but as a father who had been systematically deceived and manipulated for nearly a decade. The U.S. Attorney's Office is prepared to offer the following arrangement, Martinez said formally. Guilty plea to financial crimes carrying a 5-year sentence with possibility of parole in 2 years. Full cooperation regarding Roberto Castellano's prosecution. Complete dissolution of your criminal organization with assets forfeited to federal authorities. And in exchange, immunity for Miss Washington on all charges, protective custody for your son during proceedings, and a chance to actually be the father he needs instead of the criminal Roberto made you believe you had to be. Luis stared at the papers, seeing not legal documents, but a bridge between the life he'd been trapped in and the life Marco deserved. There's one more thing, Martinez added. Miss Washington asked me to give you this. She handed him a letter in Keisha's handwriting. Luis opened it with hands that trembled slightly. Luis, Marco asked me to tell you that he doesn't care if you're in trouble with the police, because police are supposed to catch bad guys. And you're not a bad guy. You're just his daddy who saved him from the bugs in his ears. He said to tell you that he'll wait for you to come home, no matter how long it takes, because families don't give up on each other. I told him that sounded like something a very smart, very brave little boy would say. He's right, you know. Families don't give up, and neither do I. Keiki. When Luis looked up, his eyes were wet with tears he hadn't shed since the day Marco had first called him Daddy, with a voice that worked perfectly. Where do I sign? 18 months later, Luis Castellano walked out of federal minimum security prison into Illinois sunshine, and the sight of 2 people who had redefined everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty and family. Marco had grown 3 inches and lost the uncertainty that had shadowed his eyes for 8 years. He ran toward Luis with the abandon of a child who had never doubted this moment would come, launching himself into arms that caught him with desperate relief. Daddy, I learned how to whistle while you were gone. Want to hear? The sound that emerged was slightly off-key but absolutely perfect. Luis held his son close, breathing in the scent of his hair, feeling the solid reality of his presence after months of phone calls and supervised visits. That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard. Keisha approached more slowly, beautiful in a simple sundress, her expression mixing joy with carefully controlled emotion. Luis had wondered, during the long nights of incarceration, whether she would still be there when he got out, whether love could survive the reality of federal conviction and the complete dismantling of the life they had shared. Hello, Luis. Hello, Keisha. They stood facing each other while Marco chatted excitedly about school and friends and the apartment where he and Keisha had been living. Neither adult spoke about the 18 months of separation, the difficulty of building a relationship through prison phone calls, or the uncertainty that had colored every conversation about the future. Marco, Keisha said gently, why don't you show Daddy the car? I packed some of his favorite music for the drive. As Marco ran ahead to the modest sedan that had replaced Luis's fleet of luxury vehicles, Keisha and Luis walked in silence. You stayed, Luis said finally. I promised I would. Federal conviction, prison sentence, complete financial ruin. Most women would have reconsidered their options. Keisha stopped walking, turning to face him directly. Luis Castellano, do you think I fell in love with your money or your dangerous reputation? I fell in love with a man who read bedtime stories to his son in 3 different languages, who never missed a therapy appointment, who was willing to give up everything to protect one little boy. She reached for his hands. That man just spent 18 months in federal prison to ensure his son could grow up safe and free from a legacy of violence. If anything, I love him more now than I did before. Even though I have no money, no power, no way to provide the kind of life you deserve. Luis, I grew up in public housing with a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table. I know what poverty looks like, and I know what wealth looks like. What I've learned is that neither one matters if you don't have people who love you unconditionally. She smiled, the expression transforming her face. Besides, a former federal prisoner with accounting skills and business management experience, you'll find legitimate work, maybe not running illegal enterprises, but certainly running something. From the car, Marco called impatiently. Come on, I want to show Daddy our apartment. As they drove through Chicago toward their new life, Marco provided commentary on everything he could see and hear. His vocabulary had expanded dramatically, his confidence was unshakable, and his joy was infectious. "Mrs. Chen comes to visit every week," he reported. "She taught me how to make your favorite pasta sauce. And Keisha found a school where they teach kids sign language, even if they can hear, because I want to help other kids who might have problems with their ears." Luis caught Keisha's eye in the rearview mirror. "That sounds like an excellent plan." The apartment was small but comfortable, decorated with photos of the three of them together, and artwork Marco had created during his father's absence. It felt like home in ways the mansion had never managed. That evening, after Marco had fallen asleep between them, on the couch during a movie, Luis and Keisha finally talked about the future. "Roberto?" Luis asked. "Life sentence without parole. Turns out federal prosecutors take child torture very seriously, especially when it's combined with murder and conspiracy charges." Keisha's voice was matter-of-fact. "He won't be bothering anyone again. And the family." Marco Rossini dissolved the organization completely. Some guys went legitimate. Some guys moved to other cities. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who'd hurt a kid. Luis nodded. "Good. Luis, can I ask you something? Do you miss it? The power, the control, the respect?" Luis looked at his son sleeping peacefully, then at the woman who had sacrificed 18 months of uncertainty for love and family loyalty. "I miss the illusion that I was protecting people I cared about, but I don't miss the reality of living in a world where family members torture children and murder wives." He reached for her hand. "This is better, harder, more uncertain, but better. Even though you'll never be Don Castellano again?" "Especially because I'll never be Don Castellano again. Marco doesn't need a crime boss for a father. He needs a man who comes home every night, who helps with homework, who teaches him that problems are solved with integrity instead of intimidation." Keisha leaned against his shoulder. "Speaking of homework, I should probably tell you, I've been accepted to nursing school. Part-time program so I can still be here for Marco, but I want to build something legitimate for myself. Nursing school. Taking care of people is what I do best. I figured I should get officially trained for it." Luis kissed the top of her head, marveling at this woman who had saved his son, survived federal prosecution, waited through his imprisonment, and was still planning for a better future. "Keisha Washington?" "Yes, Luis Castellano? When you're ready, when the time feels right, will you marry me? Not as part of a strategic arrangement, but because you want to build a life with a reformed criminal who loves you more than he ever thought possible." Her smile was radiant. "Luis, I've been ready for 18 months. I was just waiting for you to come home." As Chicago settled into nighttime around them, three people who had found each other through the worst circumstances imaginable began planning for the best life they could build together. It wasn't the life any of them had expected, but it was theirs. Honest, loving, and finally completely safe. Marco stirred in his sleep, mumbling something that sounded like contentment. His hearing was perfect, his future was unlimited, and his family was whole. Sometimes the best endings were really just the beginning of something better.